particularly thanks for George and Dana for inviting me. What I want to talk about today is the liberal arts, but I'm very conscious that I am speaking here in the context of bringing the liberal arts into programs for teacher training. That is an initiative whose importance cannot be overstated. I can't talk about teacher training. That's your area. I really wouldn't. If I needed to learn about teacher training, I would come talk to you. But what I can do today is focus your minds on the meaning and importance of liberal arts education. And my hope is that this clear focus will help you think about the place of liberal arts education in your own practice as teachers of teachers. I want to organize my remarks today around these three terms: liberal education, the humanities, and college. So let me start with some thoughts about liberal education. The idea of liberal education harkens back to ancient Greece, to a slave-owning society, where it was distinguished from the education of slaves. Liberal education is the education that is appropriate to those who are free. And that idea of liberal education as that which is appropriate for those who are free holds true to this day. When framing a program in liberal education, what you ask yourself is, what do people who are free need in order to live their lives most fully, in order to maximally realize their humanity? If you have a social mission, you might also ask, what does someone who is free need in order to participate in collective self-governance and contribute to society in the fullest way? So in the first place, liberal education is to teach you how to be free. It is to teach you self-governance. Self-governance in the individual sense first, but then also in the collective sense, the collective or political sense. You know, you probably, and you can, this is something that you see with your students, and which if you point out to students, they will know right away to be the case. People, for example, fail at college, not for intellectual reasons, but because of failures of self-governance. It is not that they get there and it's too hard. It's that they get there and they cannot manage the complexities of the demands that are made on them, not on an intellectual level. So you can see that from the start that liberal education is going to be different than other kinds of education offered at university. In most disciplines, the subject to be learned is at the center. The facts and skills to be taught can be codified, communicated, and then tested in straightforward ways. Not so in the liberal arts. In this field of study, the student, the individual as a living, growing entity, is at the center. The subject here is secondary. The inner transformations and developments that the subject matter promotes in the student is the education that we're after. The very act of learning in this way is an exercise in freedom. It cannot be compelled. It cannot be coerced. Students can only be liberally educated through an affirmation of their own freedom, of their moral autonomy, of their irreducible dignity. Liberal education has to take the student as an end in itself, never as a vehicle to advance any other goal. Liberal education cannot be carried out under any other premise. It's one of the things that distinguishes liberal education from specialized or professional education, where, say in graduate school, the commitment is to the field and to advancing the field. Or in professional education, the commitment is to advancing that professor, creating a professional. When we teach liberally, the object is the student. And the end goal, the deliverable, is that the student walks away with a better sense of him or herself, with a better view, with a deeper sense of self-understanding. In the Politics, Aristotle wrote that the best city-state will not confer citizenship on vulgar craftsmen, for it is impossible to engage in virtuous pursuits while living the life of a vulgar craftsman or a hired laborer. This should sound offensive to us, elitist to the maximum. It is impossible to engage in virtuous pursuits while living the life of a vulgar craftsman or a hired laborer. But as usual with the ancients, it would profit us to consider in what ways Aristotle is right. In what ways does being a vulgar craftsman or a hired laborer constrain the exercise of free citizenship? That's not hard for us to imagine. A certain degree of freedom from want and freedom from fear is a necessary precondition for the exercise of political freedom. What Aristotle is getting at is that the virtues proper to citizenship demand a kind of cultivation and freedom that are impossible if one is only concerned with making a living. Aristotle makes another very relevant point in the politics. A complete community comes to be for the sake of living, but it remains in existence for the sake of living well. Aristotle's insight here is quite crucial. While survival and sustenance are at bottom the reason why we live together, any well-organized society will overcome the threat of extinction quite quickly. Once the necessaries of survival are assured, and they are for all of us, the questions of living shift fundamentally, and we begin to concern ourselves not just with survival, but with existence. How do we live well? What kind of knowledge best guides life? What do we do now that only a small amount of our physical and mental energy needs to be devoted to surviving? It's striking to me that so much of our education, by which I mean the non-liberal part of our education, educates as if our main goal in life were to earn sustenance. It's as if we're caught in evolutionary infancy, where we cannot truly grasp the fact that meeting the basic requirements of living need no longer be our central preoccupation. But we organize our education and much of our life activity as if we still lived in the savannah, with the threat of starvation always looming. Our fear of not having enough drives us to hoard, to accumulate, and to shackle our life to what is literally a never-ending quest for more goods and more security. This hunger runs very deep in our psyche, and while we have tamed it by laws and the threat of punishment, it's still a central force in the specific ways in which we organize our society, our politics, our economy, and most relevantly in this forum, our education. Thomas Hobbes understood this clearly and noted in the Leviathan this depressing thought. In the first place, I put for a general inclination of all mankind a perpetual and restless desire of power after power that ceaseth not till death. This perpetual and restless desire of power after power, which is as human and as natural as breathing, is probably the main reason why being free is so complicated. Our freedom, our moral autonomy, our capacity to reflect and to direct our actions lives in us alongside this deep and restless hunger for power. How do we negotiate our moral freedom? How do we put that together with our desire for domination? How do we reconcile our impulse towards compassion and benevolence with our suspicions and fears? How do we manage the tangled economy of psychic forces that all flesh is heir to? These are some of the problems of human freedom. For as Hume, Freud, Nietzsche, and others have pointed out, we are not merely rational creatures. Our reason is always the servant of deeper forces of desire. While most of formal education deals with training our reason, liberal education also deals with bringing order into the economy of our desires, with refining our sensibilities, with expanding our moral imagination. That's why liberal education is always an ethical education. It is always a moral education. Ethical and moral questions are inescapable from liberal education. They are, at its very heart. Kant makes this point in the groundwork for the metaphysics of morals. The science of law and of the laws of nature is called physics, whereas the science of the laws of freedom is called ethics. Really like that quote, because freedom is not randomness. Freedom is not living chaotically, living erratically, kind of anarchism. Freedom, as Rousseau pointed out, to be driven by appetite alone is slavery. Obedience to the law one has prescribed for oneself is liberty. So the actual exercise of freedom requires self-legislating and requires rule, law-governed behavior. Only that these laws and these self-legislating rules are autonomous, they are free. Liberal education is the education that gives you the tools to be a self-legislating, autonomous, moral human being. We use a variety of methods to do that. We use great texts, as we do at Columbia. The focus in the way that we pursue liberal education at Columbia is by having students read classics of literature and of moral thought, but there are other ways of doing it. We teach the sciences liberally. The point I'm trying to drive is that if you're doing it liberally, the emphasis and the subject, the goal, is not mastery of particular body of knowledge, but the development of particular habits of mind, particular approaches to things. At Columbia, for example, this week, all of the freshmen are reading the Odyssey. All the first-year students take a course called Literature Humanities. They begin the first 2 weeks with the Iliad, and they move on into the third week, which this is, into the Odyssey. But when we're teaching the Odyssey and the Iliad to these first-year students, it's not so important whether both the Iliad and the Odyssey were written by Homer, or whether Homer lived in the 5th century or in the 7th century or the 10th century BC, or whether Homer was blind and could not read, or whether he was illiterate. Those things are not that interesting or that important. What we want is our students to read Homer and have an encounter with this mind and see what about their own humanity is illuminated by that encounter, and what about the world that Homer represents is the same and is different from the world in which we live. It is a humanistic encounter. We're not trying to turn them into literary critics or into experts on the epic genre. We're trying to refine their capacity to understand themselves and understand the big questions that have troubled every great mind in history. So, the humanities. Let's talk about the humanities for a little bit. The humanities get their start with Protagoras, pre-Socratic philosopher who in the 5th century is said to have taught that man is the measure of all things. Sorry that the quote gets cut off there. Man is the measure of all things, says Protagoras. So the humanities concern themselves with the assimilation of knowledge into the human existential reality. So typically the humanities exist in the liberal arts, in academia, under these disciplines, under literature, history, philosophy, the arts. You probably know that up until the 18th century, philosophy included what we now call science. It used to be called natural philosopher. People like Kant and Galileo and Newton were thought of as natural philosophers. Descartes, a natural philosopher. But they were engaged in empirical investigation, and eventually it branches off into the natural sciences. But the natural sciences today can also be taught as humanities and can also be taught as liberal arts. The moment that you teach a subject with these humanistic concerns at the center, you are engaged in liberal education. So what we do in the humanities is essentially to consider the world, examine it, question it, evaluate it, interpret it, through the lens of the question, what does it mean to be human? Empirical thinking is the kind of thinking that makes a correct calculation. Humanistic thinking is the kind of thinking that asks, what does it mean to make a calculation in the first place? And what is the value of making a calculation? Why should we be making this particular calculation? So empirical thinking concerns itself with the laws of the determined universe. The humanities concern themselves with what Kant calls the laws of freedom or ethics. We teach the practice of freedom. And this is something that has to come before any hint of specialization, but which is of supreme importance to the exercise of any profession. With humanistic thinking, we take our rational faculties and we aim them at things that do not admit of clear rational answers, things that are impossible to measure and quantify. Things like emotions, intention, meaning, beauty, consciousness. In the humanities, we try to examine phenomena from which we cannot possibly extricate ourselves. So we do that with as much awareness as possible of our own biases, our own values, our desires, our own investments in the investigation. So the humanistic endeavor always looks at itself. Right? The humanistic endeavor asks of itself, when I am engaged in an investigation, what is my investment? What are my biases? What are my own values that guide this investigation? That way of thinking is tricky and wondrous territory, full of surprises, harsh realizations, and sometimes disorienting encounters with truths about ourselves that are simply unacceptable or unassimilatable. As a way to get people to start thinking about what the humanities mean, I often bring up this quote from the Buddha. Too small for you to read there, so I'll read it out loud. Since it comes from an oral tradition, there's a lot of repetition, so it'll be easy to follow. The setting for this quote is Buddha is hanging out as the guest of a king named King Pasenadi, and King Pasenadi comes to the Buddha in the afternoon, and the Buddha says, "Great king, what have you been up to?" And the king says, "Oh, you know, doing affairs of state and things like that." And then Buddha says, "What do you think, great king? Suppose a man trustworthy and reliable were to come to you from the east, and on arrival would say, 'If it please your majesty, you should know that I come from the east. There I saw a great mountain, as high as the clouds, coming this way, crushing all living beings in its path. Do whatever you think should be done.' Then a second man were to come to you from the west, trustworthy, reliable. And he would say, 'If it please your majesty, you should know that I come from the west. There I saw a great mountain, as high as the clouds, coming this way, crushing all living beings. Do what you think should be done.' Then a third man would come from the north, trustworthy, reliable, and would say, 'If it please your majesty, you should know that I come from the north. There I saw a great mountain, as high as the clouds, coming this way, crushing all living beings in its path. Do what you think should be done.' And then a fourth man were to come to you from the south, and on arrival would say, 'If it please your majesty, you should know that I come from the south. There I saw a great mountain, as high as the clouds, coming this way, crushing all living beings in its path. Do whatever you think should be done.' If, great king, such a great peril should arise, such a terrible destruction of human life, the human state being so hard to obtain, what should be done?" The king says, "If, Lord, such a great peril should arise, such a terrible destruction of human life, the human state being so hard to obtain, what else should be done but Dhamma conduct, right conduct, skillful deeds, meritorious deeds?" And then the Buddha drops the nuclear bomb. I inform you, great king, I announce to you, great king, aging and death are rolling in on you. When aging and death are rolling in on you, great king, what should be done? That question hasn't gone away. That question still matters. And as long as that question continues to matter, a liberal education will be important. A liberal education brings into focus and brings into resolution the reality of our state as human beings, a reality which we in our ordinary life and pursuits go through great lengths to keep out of view. The humanities put them front and center. That's why so many great humanists have thought about death so much. But as I said, most of our education, with its emphasis on economic outcomes, educates as if our main goal in life were to earn sustenance. It is caught in our desire for domination, accumulation, and security. Our situation in this regard is analogous to our situation with regard to food. We are evolutionarily programmed to want to eat a lot more than we need, on the presumption that food will not always be available. This works both psychologically and physiologically. Psychologically, our desire for food far exceeds our need for food. Physiologically, our bodies have evolved mechanisms to hold on to every calorie by converting it to fat and storing it all around our bodies. In order to stay healthy, we have to make a conscious effort, a sometimes very difficult and painful effort, not to give our bodies the high sugar, high fat, delicious food that we're always craving. And something similar is happening at the collective level. We find ourselves trapped in the ethic of efficiency, having unconsciously adopted a value of getting more done in less time as an ultimate good. But efficiency towards what? That is a liberal arts question. We seem to have forgotten the reason why economic growth is worth pursuing and pursue it for its own sake. As a result, our economy and our modern society is sustained by structures and processes that lead to dehumanization and oppression. The bulk of our education is focused on preparing us for jobs rather than preparing us to find ways of living sustainably. But in the liberal arts classroom, we want our students to think not about what job they will have, but about what kind of life they will live. The invitation to grapple with the big questions is important because the big questions come with the territory of being free. Freedom, is great, but freedom brings its own problems. Again, it is the reason why so many of our college students fail. It is because they are suddenly free to attend class or not attend class, to do the homework or not do the homework, to prepare for an exam or not prepare to an exam. And it is that problems of freedom that complicate our students' life and indeed complicate our own lives. Let's talk about college a little bit. In the United States, almost all colleges have a set of general education requirements, mainly in the humanities, that every student must take, regardless of his or her major. As George mentioned in his very generous introduction, just last week I was in Amsterdam at a conference on the liberal arts in Europe, and the idea of the liberal arts is very alien in European institutions, which is a kind of a historical oddity and paradox, because Europe is the cradle of the liberal arts. That's where we got it. Yet today, and for a long time, education has been in Europe very, very trapped. So you go to college into a profession, and you study with people who are in the same profession. And the idea of a 4-year degree that does not give you a profession is very odd to them. In recent years, there's been a movement to establish liberal arts programs there. That's what this conference was about. But not so in the United States. In the United States, it has been central to the tradition. And one of the reasons, by the way, that Europe and Asia and Latin America have become interested in liberal arts is the recognition that in the United States, even though the primary and secondary school system is a disaster, higher education is the envy of the world. And why is that, they ask. And the answer they have come up with is the liberal arts tradition. There's a story, it may be apocryphal, I have not seen it in a documented source, I've only heard it said, that the former premier of China, President Hu, asked his education minister why, even though we're producing millions and millions of engineers and chemists and scientists, we don't have any Nobel Prizes. Whereas the United States, which produces so many fewer, gets them all the time. And supposedly the answer was, it's liberal arts. They are taught to think outside the box. They are taught to think about fundamental questions in a systematic way in college. That continues to be the case in the majority of the American system, that you spend about 2 years doing non-specialized general courses, mainly in the humanities and the social sciences. And that situation is a legacy of the early American colleges, which were initially established to educate clergymen that would be broadly learned and conversant with developments in all branches of knowledge. And actually that point, the fact that our American colleges have their roots in a ministerial calling, where, how do you prepare a person to be a shepherd of souls? They need to know some psychology, they need to know some science, they need to know some politics, they need to know some economics, they need to know everything that is human. It's like that famous quote, nothing that is human is alien to me. That is liberal education, and that's why they were educated that way. And it occurs to me, as I was thinking about this talk, it occurs to me that the closest thing that we have to that challenge today is the people you work with, people who are preparing to be teachers. They need to know about everything. They need to have a dexterity, a fluidity, a capacity for judgment, a capacity for wisdom that is not codifiable. You cannot put it in a book, have them memorize it, test them on it, and certifying them as having them. It is a quality that is of a piece with the very nature of being human, which is, to be human is to be incalculable, and is to be uncodifiable. So liberal education in the United States begins from the start, but as we know it today, liberal education really begins in the structure in which we have it in the early 20th century, with Columbia's core curriculum leading the way in 1919. It's the first liberal arts program of the type that we know today, going on 100 years, the program that I have the high privilege of directing. About 15 years later, in 1945, a committee of faculty at Harvard produced a report that became the manual for American liberal education. The report was published in a red cover, so it is widely known as the Red Book. There's the Red Book. But as you'll see, the actual title of the book is General Education in a Free Society. That title is significant because what the author saw in 1945 was a general democratization of American society, with colleges and political life beginning to be penetrated by non-elites. So they wondered, with some trepidation, what kind of general education would be appropriate for the mass of people poised to enter political life? What kind of general education is appropriate in a free society? They understood that, as a friend of mine likes to put it, the problem with democracy is that the people rule. To the extent that we neglect the liberal arts, we get Donald Trump. That is Donald Trump running. Whereas in ancient Athens, only a minority of people involved in political life required a liberal education. If we are going to have a truly free society, we will have to educate people liberally. Educate them with a view to the exercise of human freedom. A few quotes about college. I like quotes. Here's a quote from my colleague Andrew Delbanco from his book, College, What It Is, Was, and Should Be, a book that came out about 2 years ago. College should be, one of the things I love about this book and about Andy Delbanco is that he makes statements like that. College should be. Something that academics are so allergic to making these days, because when you make a statement like that, you can be proved wrong, or you can be argued against. You have to commit yourself to a point of view, which academics have made entire careers by evading. College should be an aid to reflection, a place and process whereby young people take stock of their talents and passions and begin to sort out their lives in a way true to themselves and responsible to others. The idea here of a college as a place that allows a kind of breathing room, as a place that allows students to have false starts, to make mistakes, to figure out a little bit about who they are, and to chart for themselves a path that is true to that vision and that understanding. A similar quote from a little earlier, from Daniel Bell's 1964 book, The Reforming of General Education. The idea of a four-year college as a breathing space, as a means of testing oneself and finding out who and what one is. The process of self-consciousness is built on, is vanishing as organizational harnesses are slipped on the young at an earlier and earlier age. This is the point that de Resowicz is making in his article, and somebody at my table was pointing out it's not a new phenomenon, even though his book came out last year and talks about yesterday. It's not a new phenomenon. Already here in the 60s and even before that, there's this worry, and it has accelerated. We are at a critical moment because that process has accelerated of us harnessing organizational and professional trappings on young people at an earlier and earlier age and short-circuiting this moment that college has been for self-reflection and self-discovery. Yeah. And one of my favorite quotes of all time on this issue is from the great W.E.B. Du Bois, writing This Also Black Folk. This is from an essay called On the Training of Black Men. And you know, Du Bois is writing this in 1901 and dealing with a population of black youth whose parents, many of whose parents were slaves, and who are facing the world in a flawed and exploitative democracy. What kind of education is appropriate? And here's what Du Bois writes, and as you probably know, Du Bois had a famous controversy, disagreement, polemic with Booker T. Washington, and had a different model, a different idea of what he thought was the way forward educationally for the post-Reconstruction Black American. But this is what Du Bois says: the true college will ever have one goal, not to earn meat, but to know the end and aim of the life which meat nourishes. Love that. Not to make a living, but to know what living is for. Let me begin to bring together our thoughts. Where are we today? I think our current historical moment is characterized, or can be characterized by two trends that you see almost everywhere. One is hyper-specialization. That is education and a world that is focused on narrower and narrower fields of expertise. At the same time, you have more complexity. The issues, take politically. Back in the times that we grew up, in the time of the Cold War, it was a kind of a bipolar world with the Soviet Union and the United States and the two poles, and then various countries aligned to various degrees, and conflicts and political ideologies were much more predictable, as opposed to today, where you have a fragmentation, a hydra of complexity in the political world. Same goes with markets, same goes with global warming, a complex issue, which if you are going to understand, you need to be able to handle complexity, etc. These two trends. This is the intellectual, cultural, political, economic environment for which we're training our students to live in a world that is characterized by hyper-specialization and hyper-complexity. And you can see that this does not help you with that. Hyper-specialization does not help you deal with complexity. On the contrary, hyper-specialization makes you less able to deal with complexity. Here are 4 challenges that I think the students that we teach in our colleges are going to face in the immediate future, and one could make this list a lot longer. But we are living in a historically unprecedented moment. The pace of change that we have entered is unknown in the history of humanity, and we are beginning to tap into some of the elementary biological and evolutionary functions of humanity. Never before have there been 8 billion large mammals roaming the earth, tinkering, producing, consuming, and mammals that are rational and that are self-conscious. We are changing the environment. So here's some challenges. One is the predictable and unpredictable consequences of climate change. We have already seen that, but the world in which our students are going to mature and age is going to be shaped by the consequences of what we have already done and what we can no longer reverse in a deep and fundamental way. It is a global challenge of proportions that I think we have a hard time wrapping our minds around. Another coming challenge is the extension and possibly dramatic extension of the human lifespan. We are extending how long people live, and we're getting faster at extending how long people live. The students that we teach are likely to live a lot longer than we will or than any previous generation. And that brings extraordinary social challenges, and the economic model of our society is not equipped to function with that. So it is going to force profound changes in the economic structure of society. A third challenge is forms of artificial intelligence that will rival and exceed human intelligence. And this is happening every day. We can now speak to Siri on our iPhones. In 2011, a computer named Watson beat the world champion at Jeopardy. Jeopardy is a complex natural language game, and for a computer to be able to parse that kind of language, a famous answer, you can find it on YouTube, look at the clip. There was a clue on the rhymes in Jeopardy, and the clue was, Jeopardy gives you the answer and you have to come up with the question. The answer on the rhymes was a long, tiresome speech given by a frothy pie topping. The answer, what is a meringue harangue? And Watson got that right. And the other contestants could not get that right. And Watson was not connected to the computer. What Watson did was read Wikipedia and a number of other large references very quickly, and was able to do that. Watson, now this is 2011. Watson has been speeded up 24-fold since 2011, and Watson is now being fed medical images to assist in diagnoses. Artificial intelligence, forms of artificial intelligence that will rival and exceed our own are going to be a pervasive, common. Speaking of technology,
yeah, right.
That was Dana's phone, which she was able to answer from her wrist because she has an Apple Watch. Forms of artificial intelligence that will rival and exceed human they're going to be pervasive. They're going to be ubiquitous. I'm not talking about the future. I'm talking about in the next 5 years, in the next 10 years, things that we already were seeing. And this perhaps the most fundamental of all is the genetic manipulation of human and non-human species. In 2012, there was a paper describing a technique, a genetic manipulation technique called CRISPR-Cas9. It was a discovery of, well, back in the 70s, biologists found these, what they called repeating palindromes in the DNA sequence, these sequences that kept repeating, and they had no idea what it was. Now they have figured out that it is a mechanism used by bacteria to identify genetic sequences and make cuts with using an enzyme called Cas9 where those sequences appear. Scientists have manipulated this to come up with essentially an all-purpose gene editing technique where they can go in and precisely edit a gene and put another one in. They have used this already in plants, in animals, in monkeys. No one has done it on humans yet, but there is a big concern about humans. In April this year, scientists in China shocked the world because they tried this experiment unsuccessfully on non-viable human embryos. The genie has been let out of the bottle. Whenever that happens, that this is done in a human embryo successfully, is going to introduce a genetically altered human being whose line is going to continue forever. Of course, also there are tremendous possibilities for clinical application. Anyway, we don't have, the way that we think about the world, understand the world, we don't have the apparatus to deal with these challenges. We don't know how to think about them. We don't know how to metabolize them. A liberal education is the kind of education that prepares you for what is unknown, for what is unimaginable. So, let me conclude. The type of knowledge that the liberal arts encourage is of a different sort than the kind of knowledge that dominates in the rest of the university. Generally speaking, the university is a place where the scientific paradigm of knowledge predominates. Scientific knowledge progresses cumulatively. It builds on the discoveries of the past and adds new ones on top of them. But the liberal arts don't quite progress in that way. We don't understand today the experience of grief, or how to live with the consciousness of death, or the meaning of love and nobility any better today than we did 100 years ago. The latest war novel is not an improvement on the Iliad. This doesn't mean that you don't learn things in the liberal arts, but there is a distinct way in which you learn something liberally. To learn something liberally means that you take an interest in the process of learning itself, and that you come to understand the thing learned in a larger human context. You look not only at what is being learned, but also at why it is being learned. Not only how something works, but why it matters that it works in the way that it does. One of the characteristics of liberal learning is that the learning is not just added on top of your previous stock of knowledge. Liberal learning implies an inner transformation. When you learn something liberally, it rearranges everything else that you know. You don't just end up with more knowledge, but with a different configuration of knowledge. Liberal knowledge alters the internal proportions of your psyche. Technical knowledge does not lend itself to resolving the human questions that most matter to us. Technical knowledge is appropriate for what is calculable, for what one might call determinate objects, that is, objects that exist discretely in a circumscribed field and are stable in such a way that they can be described precisely. In most cases, knowledge about such determinate objects can ultimately be expressed in mathematical form and can be easily reproduced, taught, and tested. But there are a great many things, human things, that are resistant to this kind of determinate understanding. When the questions before us concern things like justice, the good, the beautiful, the very questions that ground our existence, then technical knowledge is of limited use. To situate ourselves before the basic dilemmas of human life, to navigate our inner worlds, we have to call on capacities and intuitions that have as much to do with intellect as they do with character. Capacities and intuitions within us that precisely qualify us as free and moral agents, irreducible to calculation. That's the field of the liberal arts. Let me end with two quick quotes, and I won't comment on them, and a final thought. This is from Montaigne. Our duty is to compose our character, not to compose books, to win battles and provinces, but order and tranquility in our conduct. Our great and glorious masterpiece is to live properly. All other things, to reign, to lay up treasure, to build, are all at the best but little aids and additions. And also from Montaigne's, I study myself more than any other subject. This is my metaphysics. This is my physics. My final thought is this. In this information age, we know everything. Everything you need is accessible. With my iPhone here, I can access pretty much the entire store of human knowledge that has been produced in history. I can access it with my iPhone, essentially. So the issue is of knowing what it is one needs to know, knowing what it is one doesn't know. Knowledge is no longer the aim of education. The aim of education is judgment, discernment. We now have to pursue something higher than knowledge. We have to pursue wisdom. Okay, thank you.